Okay, welcome everyone. Sorry about the delay. I apologize for that because our first presenter had some technical problems, but now we're ready to get started. My name is David Rammel. I'm the editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review and Visual Studio Magazine, and I'm pleased to be moderating our first session as well as welcoming you to our What's New in Enterprise Net Development Summit, brought to you by Progress. The editorial staff of Visual Studio Magazine have worked hard to bring together some of the best independent experts on this topic for this event, so we really hope you enjoy it. Before we start today's event, we do have some announcements. First, we want to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Each of today's 3 sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. During today's 3rd session, we will be giving away a GoPro Hero 9, but you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we have resources from our sponsor Progress available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. It's because of Progress underwriting this content that we can bring you this summit, so we thank them for sponsoring the summit and supporting the community and ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. And because we had our first presenter having some technical problems, we're going to start off with session number 2. Our speaker for this session is Peter Vogel, principal at PH&V Information Services. Peter is a system architect for PH&V, which provides full-stack consulting from UX design to object modeling to database design. Peter also writes courses and teaches for Learning Tree International. Peter, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Oh, and it's great to be here. Thank you, David. I should tell you that David and I go back a very long way back in 1998 when I still had a job before I became an independent consultant. I started writing for VisualStudioMagazine.com, and one of the editors for the longest period of time during that 22-year association, still ongoing, by the way, obviously I'm here, has been David. So it's nice to actually hear his voice because we only communicate by email. So before we begin, let me just set the stage. Let's recognize that we all live in the video game progression. And the video game progression is that when you win, you get to play the game again, but it's harder this time. And this is your reward for winning. If we look at that in terms of the development environment that we live in, way back in the day, even before I started programming, and I'm very old, before we started programming, everybody wanted to automate payroll. So you were given this problem, automate payroll, and then the developers at the time, you, would solve the problem, probably using assembler or something, right? And then you would get a better tool. That was, okay, so now you got COBOL. So using COBOL, automating the payroll problem is going to be simpler, except you were then given a harder problem, right? Now that you had the better tool, you were given the harder problem. You had to now automate all of human resources. So what we see going on is our tools constantly chasing our problems, that we're always working on problems that stretch the abilities of our tools, because when we get better tools, they say, oh, well, you can handle a more difficult problem. So looking at this, one of the things we want to talk about is what tools are we getting to solve our current problems, and then what tools and how we're going to live with those tools as time goes on. So I want to divide this up into 3 categories, each one shorter than the last, okay? So don't panic if you go, oh my gosh, this first section, things you'll notice is going on forever, but the things you won't notice is shorter, and the skills is exactly 1 slide long. So relax. But I think the key point for all of us in attending a session like this, it's sure to see where the technology is going. And quite frankly, I'm not sure I'm going to say a lot here that's going to be earth-shatteringly new to you. I mean, we're only talking a year in the future. As Bill Gates commented on one occasion, we tend to overestimate what will change in the near future and underestimate what will happen in the long term. And so any particular year, next year, looks very much like the previous year, this year. However, 4 or 5 years out from now, wow, eh? But I'm just obligated to look at next year, so I don't think there's going to be anything earth-shattering here. So let's start off with things you'll notice. More cloud. Everybody went, boy, when he said it wasn't going to be earth-shatteringly new, he meant it. But let's recognize why people are going to the cloud. One of the first reasons we're going to the cloud is because of security. If you go to Azure, you have literally thousands of Microsoft security engineers beavering away every minute, every hour of every day, making the Azure more impregnable, more secure. In your organization, how many security engineers can you devote to the job? Now, granted, you only have to protect your applications, but quite frankly, all exploits do tend to look alike. So security is, I think, one of the driving forces that is taking people to the cloud. I'm trying to think of a major hack on an Azure application. And I'm not coming up with anything. That may just reflect my ignorance. But on the other hand, I can give you a list of major hacks on any number of other organizations on their own servers. Second thing is functionality. And let me stick with the security thing. Back in the days when security consisted of hauling around Ethernet cables and plugging in routers and setting configuration settings on the back of the router, flicking switches and stuff, nobody in their right mind would hire me as a security administrator. Now that it's all virtual, now that there is a user interface that lets you see every virtual component, everything reports to Azure Monitor. Now that you are basically configuring software, now that you've got someone building an integrated user interface that brings together the tools you need, we're seeing a de-skilling operation, quite frankly. And now a security administrator doesn't have to be someone who has an in-depth understanding of wire protocols. Now, I'm not suggesting that a reasonable human being would hire me as a security administrator. I mean, among other reasons, right? I'm a consultant. I blow into town. I blow out of town. But it's not out of the question. It would be a good stopgap measure while you look for someone more permanent. And then the third reason is money. Everything is getting more expensive. Even if you factor out our current inflationary regime, everything is getting more expensive, except cloud resources. And the result being that while developers cost you more than they did last year, while hardware costs you more than it did last year, I bet your Azure fees have not gone up by the same amount. So you put together better protection with increased access to functionality, with cheaper costs. And just as an example, I have a friend of mine works for a large retail organization. At the end of the year, they had a whole bunch of data that they'd accumulated over several years that she wanted to do a big data analysis on. There was no way they were going to go out and buy the machines that they needed, especially because she didn't know anything about big data analysis. She decided Hadoop made the most sense. You were going to get it wrong the first, that's the reality of it. You're going to get it wrong the first 5 or 6 times. But what she could do in the cloud, since that's where all their data was now, is she could rent the necessary machines. She could get it wrong 2 or 3 times. She could put in a massively parallel processing solution, figure out how that works, and then buy idle time. And if you buy idle time with virtual machines, or do parallel processing apparently, if you buy idle time, then your solution only runs when Azure has some excess capacity. Now you go, well, I can't do that. Well, she didn't care if she got the result on Wednesday of this week or Wednesday of next week. As long as they got the result, it was fine. So having the application idle for a long period of time was great. And that cut her cost, she said, by about 90%. All of a sudden, something that was financially and physically impossible for them to do, even if they wanted the computers, exactly where they're going to put them, was now perfectly reasonable And she said the information we got out of it more than paid for what costs we incurred. So that doesn't address the security issue, but it's additional functionality and cost. All right. So that you'll notice that. More client-side development. If you're exclusively a server-side development kind of person, you are a dying breed. The last client I worked with, 92nd Street Y in New York, said, and we were building an archive management system for them, said, we want everything to happen on the client. There you go. End of discussion. So we built some web services. We built an ASP.NET application whose sole purpose in life was to deliver the pages with all of our client-side code. I use React. If you're peering at that screen and trying to figure out what language, well, it's obviously JavaScript, right? Well, actually, it's TypeScript, but never mind. If you're looking at that screen trying to figure out what framework I'm using, it's React. I like React. You're going to need to do more client-side stuff. It's the way the world is going. That being the case, you want to be proactive about it. You don't want to have some tool inflicted on you the way we inflict applications on our users. What we want to do is, in fact, pick the tool that we're going to live with for the rest of our natural lives. And the rest of your natural lives these days, I think, is about 6 years. So, which leads to my next slide. It's an agile world, right? This is the agile. Look, we can deliver more functionality faster. Isn't that great? Yes, except now I have to absorb more functionality more frequently and faster. I read an article where someone said, well, agile is falling off because people aren't releasing every month. Well, you're missing the point. They could release every month. It's just their users have risen up and said, no, we're still reeling from the last release. Let's wait a couple of months. It's not clear to me that your users value lots of little releases as opposed to a few big releases. There's obviously a trade-off here. There's some point that makes more sense than once every 6 months. However, it's not clear to me that I needed 2 upgrades to Chrome in 2 weeks. And there was a while on my smartphone where I got a new version of Facebook every week. That was a nightmare. Anyway, unfortunately, it didn't make much difference to me. Whatever functionality they were adding, I wasn't using. But it's an agile world. So what does that mean in terms of you as a developer? It's a Visual Studio Code world. Okay? Visual Studio Code is Visual Studio Code is actually a terrible editor and development environment. I mean, it's just awful. But what it is a great platform for adding extensions and add-ins. So people are constantly adding these single responsibility principle extensions and add-ins. An extension or add-in that does one thing really well. Okay, like someone like ESLink do a whole bunch of things. But I think my point still stands. Most of them handle one particular problem. And there's just thousands of these suckers out there. So what you end up doing is configuring the Visual Studio project using the tools and add-ins that you want, which has led, because that by itself, I did an article for David, as a matter of fact, on configuring Visual Studio to work with Angular. I think it took me 2 separate posts and about 3,000 words to do it. It's considerably simpler now. There's now an Angular template. But the same could be true of setting up your Visual Studio Code project. So how do you set up your Visual Studio Code project? You use a scaffolding tool. In our world, that's typically going to be the .NET tool. And the .NET tool will generate a project at least minimally configured to do what you want to do and give you the support you need to do it. But notice what we're having to do there. We're now opening that DOS window, something I'd hoped we'd left behind, but we haven't. We're opening that DOS window, and we're typing in a command. And in fact, when one of the key features of Visual Studio Code is you go Control backtick, and it opens a terminal window right in Visual Studio Code. And the benefit of that is you don't have to keep the command window open any longer. You've got a command window sitting there in Visual Studio Code. If you think of the number of times you go to Package Manager in Visual Studio, that Package Manager window, I just right-click and pick Manage New Get Packages. But if you think of all that, not the number of times you go to Package Manager window, think of doing that all the time. And the reason for this is it's an agile world. We're rolling out functionality much, much faster than it can be incorporated into a GUI interface like Visual Studio. even much, much faster than it can be rolled into extensions to, the phone I'm plugged into is beeping at me, but I'll just ignore the person because I love you more. We have stuff flowing into our Visual Studio Code environment faster than even these open source extensions and add-ins can absorb them. So instead, here's a standalone utility that you can run. So it's a command line world, and it's only going to get more like that. While I say people are backing off from Agile, they're basically going from 1 sprint to 2. Yay! So what else do we get here? You're going to see the move towards code seems to be Cursor code. I started off in Visual Basic. I know you've now lost all respect for me as a human being or as a coder. But I started off in Visual Basic. Heck, I started off in COBOL and PL1 and RPG. The difference between those and the C languages, the languages that descended from C, is that those languages actually had words and sentences in them. C is a language that consists almost entirely, C and its descendants, is a language that consists almost entirely of white space and punctuation marks. And that's where the world has decided to go. This is obviously not new, but it's accelerating. So if you look at this page, for example, where we've got, I've taken a sample of C# patterns, which is something that is increasingly more important part of C# in the .NET Core environment. If you're not familiar with patterns, I'm hoping you look at that and go, excuse me? So we have a Lambda expression called getGroupTicketPriceDiscount at the top. And then we have, okay, that's definitely not what I think of when I think of a switch and case statement. And there sure seem to be a lot of underscores there. And when I read those underscores, they all lead to more arrows, more Lambda expressions. And then down at the bottom, everything up top was enclosed in parentheses, but the one down at the bottom, the last line, doesn't have any parentheses. I bet that's the otherwise or else block down there at the end for the switch statement. But it's going to require a certain amount of decoding. Now, what's lunacy about this is that after doing this 5 or 6 times, you're completely brainwashed and you read it and you go, oh, I know what's going on here. This is another example of C# patterns and I can read them. But this is where all of our code is going, Cursor and Cursor and Cursor, more and more functionality in fewer and fewer keystrokes. I personally am opposed to fewer and fewer keystrokes because as a consultant, I am paid by the hour, so I prefer more keystrokes. I don't know why we abandoned COBOL, quite frankly. By the way, as long as we're here, let me mention something that I didn't put on a slide, and that's the flip side of this. One of the other things you should seriously start embracing is low code. People who don't write any code at all. I think it's worth looking at logic apps in Azure, for example. And not only low code, but citizen developers, as they now call them. People who are developing low code or even no code solutions who are not part of your IT department. You can object to that if you want. Not going to do you a bit of good. And in fact, whole organizations like ServiceNow are devoted now to creating programs to do nothing but develop citizen developers. Now, the good news is, at least with ServiceNow, what they're looking at is how do those people partner with IT rather than being a shadow IT department. But that partnership is only going to work if you play too. So I think you should be looking at low code and citizen developers. All right, let's get back to what we're doing. So you're going to see more debugging integration. You're going to see more hot reload. The ultimate, and I think we will be here by the end of the year if we're not already, the ultimate will be when you're doing client-side development and you go, oh, that's not right. You'll press F12 to open your developer window. You'll go into the HTML in the developer window. You'll change the HTML. You will then surf to your JavaScript file still in your browser. You will make changes to your JavaScript file. You will then rerun your page, and now it's working right, and now you'll click the Save button, and it'll save your changes back to your project. So I think you're looking, hot reload is going to lead inevitably to doing much of your client-side development, and you are going to be a client-side developer, much of your client-side development in the browser, and do the initial work in the in your studio, in whatever IDE you have. But then your debugging and the fixes that you discover as you debug will be in your code, in your browser window. .NET 6 continues this. With .NET 6, you can embed that PDB file, the program debug file, that basically among other things, establishes the relationship between your compiled code and your source code, that cross-reference. You can embed that PDB file and your source files, your actual source code. I mean, Microsoft has been moving the source code to your website since forever now. Remember, forever is 5 or 6 years. You can embed those in your executables. The result is you do not have to open your project to start a debug session. All of the debug information is in your deployed executable. And again, this is going to be a hot reload session. There you go. If not now, soon. So this is the way your world's going. And again, the client-side environment brings out many of the themes I'm talking about here, that you will, if you're working in Visual Studio Code and you decide to do client-side testing, you are effectively working in a constant hot reload environment. You're also going to see more and more options for control over your code. Null is now no longer regarded as an annoyance. It is now regarded as truly evil and something you should control. Immutability isn't, oh yeah, I've got some read-only variables. Immutability is now central to should be central to the design of your applications. And these are just the tip of the iceberg. I'm going to do some gloating here. Back in 2015, I wrote an article for David on domain-driven design and why it upended many of the common assumptions we made. That article's worth going back to because, quite frankly, most of these changes that we're seeing were part of domain-driven design, and they just now become sort of common knowledge. So this is the rise of more and more read-only objects. In .NET Core 6, we have a span object that lets you access a hunk of contiguous memory. Right off the bat, I question why I want to access a hunk of contiguous memory. That's the very reason I went to .NET, was to not deal with that anymore. And now there's a read-only span object that lets you access a hunk of contiguous memory that you can't change. There you go. But more and more, you're going to be declaring things as read-only, more and more use of the const variable. You need to understand the concept that domain-driven design brought along, which is the difference between value objects and every other kind of object. And that's going to be an important distinction in your life. It is a microservice world. So on our left here, we have our user. Our user interacts with a web application that lets them enter a sales order, and you've been tasked with finding a bug in the sales order process. So you go and look at the sales order application that the user is interacting with. You discover it's nothing but client-side code, a little bit of server-side code that prepares it. But good news, that sales order application calls a API management. It calls a URL, which turns out to be embedded in API management. You go to API management, there's no business functionality in API management. It's checking for a license key. It's anonymizing return, stripping out all the platform information that's normally embedded in the headers that you return to a client from a web service. It's doing a whole bunch of infrastructure stuff. It's not doing any actual processing. So you follow that, though, to where the processing is, and that turns out to be Microsoft. You can't have too many names for the same thing, or people will figure out what we're doing. So Microsoft alternates between referring to app services as app services and referring to them as web apps. I put web app on this page for some reason. So you find it's going to a web app service that has got your web service running inside of it. Could have been worse. Could have been a container. And what do you say? Okay, here's my business processing. But what you discover is that the web service just writes a message out to queue storage. And so you go and you look at the queue storage, and there's whole bunches of messages sitting on the queue storage. Thank you, Storage Explorer. And there's no processing there either. Surely the point of this application isn't just to put stuff on Q storage. No, it isn't, but stop calling me Shirley. So then you realize that what's happening is, of course, when you write something, notice the use of the word of course, when you write something to Q storage, it fires an event. And so that event is caught by, turns out, an Azure function subscribes to that event, and the Azure function, it writes to the database. Yay, finally processing. I can figure out what the problem is until you realize that there may be 3 or 4 other applications that you don't know about that are reading messages off that queue. Notice I said storage queue. If it's a service bus, there'd only be one thing reading it. Storage queue, that can have multiple processors, consumers reading off of that storage queue. And of course, the function app was merely the first thing you found that was subscribing to that event. So now you've got to track down where the problem is happening. This is why debugging is becoming so important. And let me go back to Azure functionality. One of the benefits of Azure is I can pick, for example, that web service application in the application map, go away for an hour, and when I come back, that application map will be populated with, I betcha, the storage queue, all the consumers reading that storage queue, the event, and any other events that are being part of this process, and everything that's reading those events. Now I've got at least a shot because of the tooling, because of the debug support, because I'm working in Azure. I've got a shot at finding where the problem is. What we're seeing here is the ultimate triumph of the single responsibility principle. It used to be, we said, the single responsibility principle was a method does one thing well. Then we said, well, it's a class does one thing well. There's only one reason to change this class. Microservices, I think we're at the end of the road now. Microservices say this application does one thing well. And we build our systems out of multiple single-purpose applications, each of which could be rebuilt in 4 to 8 weeks because they just do one thing, and they do it very well. So again, this is also part of domain-driven design, and this is your future. So what does that mean? Well, if you're working on an Agile team, one of the rules of Agile is there are no specialists. Everybody has to be able to do everything. There may be people, if we can get them to work on this, great, they're better than the rest of us. But fundamentally, you're going to have to know everything. And notice what we just went through in that microservice. We went through the web application, we went through the web service, we went through the Azure function, we went through the storage queue. Microsoft recently threw away half of my certifications. I love certifications. I've never met a certification exam I didn't want to take. If you're thinking about taking a certification exam, somewhere in here there'll be my email. I have a 4-page document on how to prepare for and pass, and I have a pretty good pass rate. How to prepare for and pass and deal with strategy and tactics for dealing with Microsoft certification exam. Be delighted to send it to you. It's conceivable it might even be helpful. But it's a diverse world, and Microsoft threw out all of my technology-related certifications, ASP.NET, C#, all gone, and they replaced them with role certifications. What do you need to do this job? And it turns out to do Microsoft things, and I believe they're right, to do any one of these jobs, you've got to know a ton of things. So as a result, there are fewer and fewer experts and more generalists. And so we get to the real definition of programming. The real definition of programming is Googling Stack Overflow. When you have a problem, you type it into the Google search box, and 9 times out of 10, the answer at the top is the one you want, and it's the answer from Stack Overflow. You just can't be bothered surfing to Stack Overflow first. So this is your world. I used to have a T-shirt that said, no matter how much you know today, you're going to need more tomorrow, and I think that's wrong. I think it's no matter how much you know today, it's not going to be enough for today. So it's a diverse world. You're going to have to know more and more about more and more things. Not even be an expert, right? An expert knows less and less, knows more and more about fewer and fewer things. But you're going to have to know more and more about more things. This is probably the part you expected me to spend a lot of time on. We are still searching for integration, right once. Sadly, that usually comes with debug everywhere. What we really want is write once without the debug everywhere. We're seeing some of that already. The Mono engine, which is what Xamarin uses to deliver to Android and iOS and Mac, is now part of the .NET runtime. It's not a separate thing that you use when you're doing Xamarin, for instance. Maui delivers to iOS, Android, Mac OS, and Windows, or will when it's done. And at which point you may be going, I'm sorry, isn't that what Xamarin does already? Yes, that's exactly what Xamarin does already. I'm not suggesting that Maui is Xamarin rebranded, but I think the intent is the same. I think Maui is its own product and has got its own life and has absorbed Xamarin, but that's what we're looking for. Now, I don't spend a lot of time on this for a couple of reasons. One, we already had Xamarin. Two, Maui is great, but it is the same goal. And it's not clear to me that a lot of us actually have a passionate desire to deliver to all of those platforms. And I speak as a Xamarin developer. And quite frankly, as someone who's a member of the Usability Professional Association, we changed our name, User Experience Professional Association, someone who's spoken a lot and written about and written courses on user experience design, it's not the technology that's the issue. The issue is user experience, right? This looks great on the desktop. Now I'm going to bring it up on my phone and, ooh, whoa, that's ugly or unusable. Actually, probably both. So I'll design for my phone first, and now I'll bring it up on my desktop. And why do I have all this empty space on my big, beautiful screen? This is the user experience is the real issue here. The technology is a means of working with solutions for the user experience. But if you want to see what's possible, the UNO project, which, by the way, has Visual Studio templates, and you can build UNO projects in Visual Studio right now, like today, and you've been able to do it for well over a year now. It's an open source project. I'm probably especially fond of it because I'm from Canada and it's based in Montreal. But it delivers to iOS, Android, Mac OS, and Windows, and also to every browser in the known universe. And the reason it does that is because it generates web applications using WebAssembly. And it's recycling existing Microsoft technology, like, for example, XAML. So this is the write once without debug everywhere is certainly possible, and demonstrates it. Just not sure we really care. But I can tell you what you are going to be doing. You may not be delivering multi-platform apps, but I tell you, you're going to be doing a lot more QA. You're going to be doing a lot more testing, a lot more quality assurance. They have two names for this movement. One is based on the sort of fundamental idea that the earlier you catch bugs, almost always it's cheaper to fix them when you catch them earlier. There's the odd bug you catch late where you go, oh, well, this is trivial to fix. You're usually wrong, but sometimes it really is trivial. But bugs caught earlier, generally speaking, are cheaper to fix and easier to fix. So we have a couple of brandings to sell this to you, other than, you're going to do more testing. Don't make me do more testing. We have a Q&A member. We have a QA member. Q&A. Quality assurance. You can tell me what I'm worried about in this session. It's the Q&A session at the end. Quality assurance person is going to be a permanent part of your team. Oh, good. Yay. No, you're going to be doing more of it. You're probably going to have a QA person part of your team, too, but they'll only be there part-time. You're going to do more. They call this shift-left thinking, and the idea is that you have a development path that begins on the left and continues to the right with deployment, finishing with deployment, and testing happens just before deployment, right, when it's useless and expensive. So the idea is to shift more and more testing towards the left, shift-left thinking. The other word that they use for this is everybody loves DevOps. I mean, maybe not the people actually doing it, but everybody loves talking about it and the concept of DevOps. Maybe not the operations people who see their jobs at risk. Maybe if you're on it. But so now we have SecOps and TestOps, that in the same way that you are responsible for the operational excellence of your application, you are also responsible for the test results of your application. So the screen you see here is again from a React environment, but the tool I'm using, and as usual with JavaScript solutions, there's a hodgepodge of tools involved. I think I'm using Jeff to run my tests, Enzyme to provide some key functions, and Test Library to, I've lost track, Test Library to provide some additional functionalities. But it's Hot Reload in action. As I write my test, when I save my test, it rebuilds this panel that tells me what I want to know. When I write my code and save my code, it rebuilds this panel. Visual Studio Test has been doing this from, well, even before .NET Core. You could go into a hot test environment. This is going to be not just, oh, this neat feature. This is going to be the way we live. Hot reload plus the fact that you're going to be doing more and more testing. So if you look at Progress, and I got to tell you, I was surprised to discover Progress was sponsoring this. I do a lot of tech writing for Progress. If you go to the Progress blog, you'll find a lot of my stuff there. So it was sort of a pleasant surprise when they said, oh, yeah, Progress is sponsoring this. But it has meant that I've become very familiar with the Progress test tools. And the Progress test tools are obviously aimed at empowering people to do testing. I use empowering to try to sell this. Yeah, empowering people to do testing, even if you aren't a tester, even if that isn't your profession. And in fact, if you're a coder, they've got this whole code-driven system you can buy into if you want. So anyway, so hot reload testing, client side, there's a lot of stories coming together. They all support each other, which is one of the reasons I think this is your future. All right, how about the things you won't notice? Things are going to change that you're not going to notice. Now, you may wonder where I get my opinions from, and really it's three sources. One, as I suggested, as a developer, working as a consultant, I work with clients and I see what they want and what functionality they want, where they're pushing me to adopt new technologies. As a technical writer, writing for software developers, software vendors, I see where they're taking their tools, where they see the next big thing is, and I'm assuming they're right. And as an instructor and course author, I see where organizations, where they're sending their employees for training, where they think they're going to be going next. So that's driving, I think, what you will see. Things you won't are the things that are going to happen whether you do anything at all. Things you won't is the stuff that's going to happen to you if you do nothing yourself other than continue to upgrade your software packages. So these are the things we don't send people for training. These are the things that don't get written about. These are the things that the clients don't say, oh, and make sure you include this. So what will you get? Your application will run faster. It will. Now, you have to recognize, the performance improvement in .NET 6 Core is pretty great. However, having said that, I'm not one of those people who say, oh, look, I've got this neat programming hack, and if you implement this programming hack and run it 5,000 times, you'll save a quarter of a second. I'm going, you've obviously mistaken me for someone who cares. When I say there's a performance improvement, I mean my user goes, oh, that was faster. And if I don't get that, it's not faster. And the thing is, we are probably all building business applications. So our access, our speed, our performance, our response time is really controlled by the number of times we go to the database and pulling data out of the database. Two slowest things we can do in data processing: read and write our hard disk, issue a call to another computer. So the result is our code is running faster, but it's very much like speeding in the city. You just get to the next red light, your next data access. You get to the next red light as fast as possible. Nonetheless, it will be running faster, and it's certainly possible that you might actually notice that. In your development environments, you'll be getting more help. Now, will you notice that you're getting more help? My guess is not. My guess is we're seeing a whole bunch of incremental additions. And we're seeing additional functionality that we may never trigger. I was actually working at a client not all that long ago where I leaned over to somebody and I said, rather than searching for that method, if you just click on the method call and press F12, it will take you to the method. And he went, really? I went, yes. Fresh out of school, not his fault. Anyway, But you'll be getting more and more help. I'm already in the position with at least a couple of my development tools that when I click on things, I get so much help I can no longer see my code. You'll have to get involved, if only to keep the stuff that you want and turn off the stuff you don't want. But nonetheless, I don't see a revolution in help. I just see you getting more help on more things, and as a result, because it's incremental, you probably won't notice that you didn't get that before, and now you're getting it. Or it's available, but you don't know how to access it, or you don't know that you can access it, so you won't take advantage of it. You're going to get more AI, except when it's dumb. This is what I call the chatbot problem. I loathe chatbots with every fiber of my being. However, I suspect I probably interact with more chatbots than I know of. That in fact, the chatbots that I hate so much are the ones that aren't good enough for the scenario they've been embedded into. And there's any number of chatbots that have passed the Turing test, shall we say, and have fooled me. Well, we're going to find that with AI. I don't think you will be interacting necessarily. I suspect most of us won't be interacting directly with AI resources. But what we will be doing is interacting with software as a service, other services in our environment, and those are going to be using AI. So we'll get better diagnostics when something goes wrong with our program. We will get better searching when we go spelunking through our logs, trying to figure out why this thing went wrong last Tuesday and no one mentioned it until now. We'll get better compile time error messages. Right now, one of the key things for any technology is that you develop programmer lore with it. And one of the signs of programmer lore is that you know what the error messages really mean. So that if an error message pops up and says, object is cannot call a method on an object on a variable set to null, you go, I forgot to initialize it, and you don't look at that line of code. You scroll up to where you thought you would have initialized that object variable. So when you will notice AI is when it goes wrong, like when I notice chatbots. But the rest of the time, you'll just say, I'm getting better. Subconsciously, you may notice you're getting better quality responses from the tools you interact with and the services you interact with. Oh, and the marketing material will tell you that it's AI-driven. That's how you'll know. WebAssembly. You're going to see, I think, and you look at GitHub, there are a ton of WebAssembly projects on there. You're going to see more and more resources, client-side resources, I grant you, written in WebAssembly. But once you've written that resource, if it makes sense on the server, there's WebAssembly engines on the server. Why not make the resource available on the server also? Now, will you be aware that it's written in WebAssembly? Maybe, maybe not. I think initially, perhaps, setting up an environment that allows you to use a WebAssembly resource will require some conscious attention on your part, but it's entirely possible that by the time the WebAssembly resources become available to you, they will have become just, oh yes, this is set up. You do .NET, whatever, and the WebAssembly support is built in as part of the scaffolding for your project. You pick a template in Visual Studio for your server-side stuff, and the WebAssembly support is built in. Hopefully it'll mean Blazor will finally catch on. I wrote a course on Blazor for Learning Tree, and over 12 people take it every year. So I keep hoping. You could all go out and register for the course now. I get a royalty every time somebody takes it. So. And maybe Blazor will take off. Now, that'd be a tremendous advantage because it means the client-side tool you can pick, and you're going to need a client-side tool. The client-side tool you pick can be one that looks very much like your server-side tool, so that would be wonderful. All right, so what skills do you need? Remember I said this is only one slide long. Yeah, it's one slide long, but it's got, I think, like 12 bullet points on it. So you could say I lied to you. I misled you. Let's go with that. First, to quote my mother, get with the program. Stop whining. I assume people who attend sessions like this are not whiners. But honest to gosh, folks, if I read one more blog post about how the latest change to C# has ruined the language, I'm going to gouge out my eyes. I'm lying. Plainly, I'm not going to do it. I won't give you the satisfaction. But you know what? C# has been around for, well, let's see, I started with .NET when it rolled out. Is it 10 years yet? I went through 7 languages before I got to C#, every one of which is still around and has not been ruined. It was time to move on from Visual Basic, and I did. Right? I think one of the problems we had a while there where our tools lasted 6 years. Remember, in our world, 6 years is forever. So the assumption is we wouldn't see change anymore. Well, guess what? We're an agile world. What you know today isn't enough for what you need to know today to get your job done today. So to quote my mother, get with the program, all right? Learn to type more accurately. If it's a command line world, I'm still not ready to type 120-character PowerShell commands into the Azure Cloud Shell. But I suspect it's eventually my future, if for no other reason than the Azure UI. The Azure UI changes so frequently that literally I've done something in the Azure portal on Friday, come back on Monday, gotten to that same point in the process, and, oh, this isn't right. This drop-down list used to have 14 choices on it. Now it has 2, neither of which are the one I want. I must have done something wrong. So you back up and you do it again, and no, this is your new reality. Over the weekend, things got enhanced. The nice thing about the PowerShell commands is they don't change as much. They don't ever change. But the UI is constantly being enhanced. By the way, it turns out, with that particular example, when I actually read the items on the drop-down list, the top one sounded like a description of the old list. So when I clicked on the top one, what it did was it rewrote the drop-down list to show the 14 items that I was used to and had the one I wanted. Terrible user interface design. There should have been checkboxes that allowed you to pick which drop-down list you want, or 2 drop-down lists, and you pick the one you wanted. But too late now. If you've been taking pride in your work because you follow the solid principles, good for you. I mean that. Good for you. You're writing great code. Solid is no longer the end of the line. Solid is no longer the acme of application development. Solid is what we now take for granted. You know what? You're not using GoTo anymore, are you? GoTo is a 4-letter word. But solid is now what we take for, sorry. There we go. Solid, actually, I don't even think that was me. Oh, no, it was actually. I'm holding a pen here. Solid is where you start now. And we've got to look at immutability, we've got to look at managing nulls, we've got to look at value objects, we've got to look at all of those things to build great applications that will live in a single responsibility world. It'll live in a microservices world. You might as well learn the theory of testing. By the way, if you're looking, the book I like best on sort of what testing means and how testing works is called Agile Testing, even if you're not in an agile environment. I really like the Agile. I'm not saying it's the best book, but of the books I've read, Agile Testing was the one that meant the most to me. It's by 2 women, Lisa and Jackie, but I can't remember their last names. If you're going to be doing more testing, you should understand what you're doing. Duh, eh? So don't just learn the testing tools. Learn to think in a testing way. It's part of your future. Pick a client-side package. If I were picking today, I would pick Vue. Vogel's law for moving to new technologies is you should pick the youngest capable technology you can find because you want to spend as long with it as you possibly can because that's how you develop programmer lore. That's how you learn what the error messages really mean, is by living with the technology for a long period of time. If I were picking a client-side package right now, I would say Vue is probably the youngest capable package. I'm going to stick with React, but if I were you, and we're probably both glad that I'm not, that's what you should do. And embrace Azure. And the first step in that, get AZ204 certified. Certification gives you feedback. If you don't get certified, and I realize I've never met a certification exam I haven't wanted to take. What can I say? There's a 12-step program for this. I just haven't gotten to the first step yet. Get AZ204 certified. It covers all the technologies that Microsoft thinks you need to function in Azure. Actually, it's not all the technologies. It's all the technologies they can fit into a 6-day course. It's actually a 5-day course, which makes for interesting timing problems when you're teaching it, but that's not your problem. But AZ-204 is what Microsoft thinks you need, all the stuff Microsoft thinks you need to exist as a developer. Then keep going. So certification forces you to not know just the stuff that you need to know to do your job. It forces you to know all the stuff you might ever need to do, which means you'll come up with better solutions. And who knows, maybe tomorrow you will know all the stuff you need to know for tomorrow. And then keep going. As I say, there's been a de-skilling process going through happening as we go to the cloud. There's no reason you can't be a security manager. There's no reason you can't be a network manager in a virtual environment. You know, I mean, if you can play through to the end of the latest Marvel video game, you can play through to the end of setting up a virtual network. Even if you don't want to make that part of your skill set, you're going to have to talk to the lunatics who are doing that stuff. If you know that area, that conversation is going to go faster and better. And as I say, look at low-code tools. You want to make the best use of your time. There are some problems that are best suited for low-code tools. So while they've taken logic apps out of the AZ-204, I think it's worth spending some time on myself. All right, I'm done. I ran out of slides. I must be broke. I don't have any checks in my checkbook anymore.
Okay. Thanks, Peter, for stepping up to the plate early and delivering a great presentation.
Oh, well, thank you.
Okay, everyone else, we're running a little late because of technical problems, so now we'll skip the Q&A and take a short break and be back with the second session, Reason to Move Your Development to Visual Studio 2022. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow presenters, and, of course, Progress for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. I'm David Rammel, editor of Visual Studio Magazine, here to moderate the second session of the summit called Reasons to Move Your Development to Visual Studio 2022. This session features Sean Wildermuth, 17-time Microsoft MVP at Wilderminds, LLC. Sean has been tinkering with computers and software since he got a VIC-20 back in the early 80s. As a Microsoft MVP since 2003, he's also involved with Microsoft as an ASP.NET Insider and Client Dev Insider. You may have taken one of his more than 20 courses on Pluralsight. He's authored 8 books and many articles on software development. You can also see him at one of the local and international conferences he's spoken at. You can reach him at his blog at wildermuth.com. He's also making his first feature-length documentary about software developers today called Hello World, the Film. You can see more about that at helloworldfilm.com. Sean, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, David. I want to thank everyone for coming to the talk and apologize for you may be arriving an hour later than we all expected me to be here, but mistakes were made. So I want to talk about Visual Studio sort of in depth because 2022 is a major change to the way that we've been working with Visual Studio up to now. Now, I'm a longtime Microsoft developer, and so I remember when Visual Studio was sort of the switch from Visual C++ back in the day. And I worked with Visual Studio early on back in, I guess it was 2020. I guess it was 19. You can see how long it's been. In the late 90s. In 1989, I think is when I first got my hands on an early build of Visual Studio, and it's made great strides over that time. One of the things that had been bandied about for a long time was the limitations of Visual Studio being a 32-bit product. Now, back in 99 or even 2010, this wasn't nearly as much of an issue because a lot of our machines didn't have much more memory than Visual Studio could handle. But Microsoft has finally made the change, made that left turn, and decided to go 64-bit. But this hasn't been without some limitations or some change, when moving to 64-bit, it means that everyone who interacts with it, third-party products, extensions, etc., needed to be aware and make that change. And they've really, I think, handled it pretty smoothly. So for me, the biggest reason to move to 2022 is this 64-bitness. I'm going to show you a number of new features that are going to be driven by this. But if you're an enterprise developer, you're going to gain the benefit of being able to not worry about running into that 4 gig memory limit much, much faster. Coming with that, they're able to do a lot more performance improvements because they have a little bit more headroom of not slowing down the rest of the machine because they're not filling up the memory quite as much. Now, of course, if your dev box is an 8 gig machine, you might not see as many of these improvements as something that has closer to 16 gigs as far as memory goes. But you will see some benefits because the collision or the trying to fit everything into that magic box should be a lot more obvious. We're also going to talk about that one of the main goals with Microsoft and developers today is this AI-driven code completion. And it's going to try to do a really good job of helping you do the right thing, but it's just guessing. The last speaker spoke a little bit about this, and I think it's important for us to sort of remember that AI is as smart or as dumb as the code that's being fed into it. And so the benefit of AI helping you sort of guess what you're going to do next and help you do that quicker is a laudable goal. But also the data set it's working with is every developer that has code on GitHub and some other sources. And so you're getting this idea about the sort of the global developer hive mind. And that means every developer that you've rolled your eyes at also has code in there, not just the developers that you look up to, right? And so having that sort of sense of this, I think, is going to be important. I'm going to go through a couple more slides talking about some of the features, and then we're going to walk through them directly in Visual Studio. So some of the other productivity improvements you can see, Hot Reload. Hot Reload is going to be one of the big new features. Obviously, there was a lot of discussion amongst out there when Microsoft removed and then added this back to some of the command line tooling. And I'll show you what all the fuss is about and why it might matter to you. There's refactoring improvements for almost every language on there. If you're doing any sort of Linux or WSL development, you'll now be able to run and debug C++ projects directly in WSL. So if that's important to you, that's a big deal. I actually won't be showing that because of the complexity of making that work. And one of the things I was surprised and really ecstatic about, frankly, is that Visual Studio 2022 wasn't only about like Visual Studio Core and the latest bits. They've revamped and rebuilt their XAML and web forms designers. And so you're now getting completely live preview with XAML, and web forms. And so this was all new development to work with the 64-bit environment and should be an upgrade for both systems to be able to make changes, live changes in XAML and web forms. So as almost every organization out there that is on the Microsoft stack, you probably have WPF and in many ways much more important web forms projects that you're still having to maintain or you're still developing and they haven't jettisoned or chucked any of those. In fact, you can still create new web forms projects directly in Visual Studio 2022 if you have the need for that. While Microsoft isn't investing a lot into web forms, it certainly isn't going away, and they're not completely abandoning it like a lot of people were afraid of. We know I know that when I speak to customers, they're always concerned with, well, I have these huge investments in web forms, and the cost to change this amount of code that has run our business for the last 15 years is huge, and I'd rather invest that in someplace else than having to convert all this old code and hopefully it stay the same. And so Microsoft is continuing to support you there. For those of you that are using Git with large projects, you probably ran into the problem of what about Git repos that I have inside of my project where I have more than one Git repo for a particular project. And this is one that basically we had to abandon using Git in these large repositories within Visual Studio and just do everything at the command line. And they've changed this. They have experimental support for this, and I'll show you how to turn that on and how to test that in a little bit. Another big feature is the new Razor editor. So whether you're doing Blazor, Razor Pages, or MVC projects, the new Razor editor includes a lot of the sort of refactoring and work that we were used to in the C# editor. So being able to automatically add usings and refactor and create sections for, take embedded code and create code behind files, like all of that is now available. And they're sharing the editor space with Visual Studio Code as well. So if you happen to be doing some of your work in Visual Studio Code, you'll gain those Razor editor improvements as well, which I think is just a huge win. And the last thing we'll talk about is the bad. So with any new big platform change, you're going to run into some hiccups and some things to avoid. And while these aren't going to get in your way for the most part, there are performance hiccups that are happening here and there. And that's just as Microsoft makes these point changes. I think some more and more of these will go away. I'll talk a little bit about the extensions I use as well as the ones, some of the features I turn off in order to avoid these performance hiccups. The last thing that's sort of bad, and the last speaker talked a little bit about .MAUI and its relationship with and all that, is that .NET MAUI didn't make it into Visual Studio 22. This was a big promise for a long time, and if you're not familiar with MAUI, it's a sort of a merging of XAML-based development into sort of one space where you could write applications across Windows, Mac, and mobile devices as well. This is Microsoft's another attempt at sort of the UWP and all these other sort of tries at one platform, write once, debug everywhere sort of environment. And they decided to push it out because it wasn't ready. And so while that was the right decision, if you'd started to invest in MAUI like I had, having it being pushed out a year is a little painful, to be perfectly honest. So let's look at Visual Studio. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and this could not, this will not go badly, I'm sure, because you never know. So I'm on the screen, good. And we're over in Visual Studio, and this is Visual Studio 2022. So you can see it's the 64-bit version. And I'm using the community, but you could certainly be using the professional or the enterprise, and everything I'm going to show you will work in all of them. And if you're coming from a much earlier version of Visual Studio, if you're still working in 2012 or 2015 or any of those earlier versions, one of the things that is important is to actually look at, and if we look at tools, get tools and features, Visual Studio Installer becomes sort of part of the story that is important, because you have to realize what you're going to use and what you're not going to use. And so I have a lot of this installed. I don't do a lot of Node or whatever, but one thing to realize is that Visual Studio is really meant for a lot of different kinds of developers. So if you're a polyglot project, and you do some Python, maybe because you're doing some machine learning or you're doing Node for some other reasons, that you're going to want to sort of opt into the pieces that are important to you. The reason I show this is mostly for the individual components, because for a lot of enterprises that are using older technologies, you're going to want to make sure that you're getting some of these that may not be obvious. So the .NET 6 runtime for all your new core-based technology is great, but when we look down here, there's a few of these that are super critical for most developers, and that is the SDKs for the .NET desktop framework. So if you're still working with any of those, you're going to want to check whichever versions you're using. You can see it's going back to .NET 3.5. And this is the one that seems to bite people most, and that is the .NET Framework and item template. So if you need to create new projects for the .NET Framework, you're going to need to opt into this. This isn't checked by default in any of these major workloads. So I'm not going to go through this entire list, obviously, it's enormous, but this is the one I really wanted to point out, that if you need new .NET Framework projects and templates, not just open existing projects, but create new ones, this is going to be the true key for what you want to do there. And so I'm not actually going to modify this. I'll come back to here. And I'm going to start in sort of a typical place, and that is talk about .NET Core and some of the changes that are going to confuse developers at first. And we're just going to create a new project. And I'm just going to create a ASP.NET Core app. This will be, if you're using more modern tech, this is going to be sort of where you're starting. And so I'll just call this one with Core. Hopefully I haven't used that before. And you'll notice when you do this, it's going to give you three sort of options. 3.1, which is another long-term supported version, 6.0, which is long-term support, or 5, which is one that's going to go out of support pretty quickly, but you may need that. And so I'm just going to create 6 because it creates these projects in a bit of a different way. One of the problems that Microsoft has is they have versions of C# and they have versions of .NET Core, and while they have them aligned together, it can be a little confusing for users which they're actually using. For the most part, .NET 6 is going to be using the latest version of C#, which is 10, and with that comes some changes in the way that C# is structured. You don't need to opt in any of these, but it's important for you to at least know what they look like so that when you see them in the default application. So let's go ahead and create that. And I'm not going to walk through creating a whole application or anything, but I wanted to show you some of the things that are going to be opted in if you are starting new with Core in 2022. The biggest change is the startup application. Now, you're going to see this in all sorts of Core applications, and so it's going to be something you're going to want to be aware of, and that is this doesn't look like C# code to most people. This is using something called top-level statements, which is the ability in program.cs to just write code, and that it's going to magically put it in a void main function for you. You can see that it still has access to things like args, but it's doing some magic so that startup experience, that first experience with C# is a little easier. And so if you've done Core before, this is obviously going to look a lot different, though the pieces are all the same. Setting up your services, setting up your middleware, and then running the application. And I'm not going to walk through everything this does, obviously, but I wanted you to really see that. The other piece that is turned on by default, I'm going to actually open up the project file. That is going to bite you is there's two. There's nullable enabled and implicit usings enabled. And what do both of those mean? Nullable means that by default, all the types. So let's create a class down here. I'll call it person. And if I just give it a string name, right? Pretty simple. This is going to seem and act just like you would want it to. But you'll notice it's giving you this warning that says a non-nullable type here cannot have a non-null value when exiting the constructor. And that's a lot of words, meaning that it assumes that name always has a value. And this is the new this was something we could opt into for the last few versions of C#, but is now turned on by default. If you have a large project here, you can change this to disabled and just go about your life, which a lot of people are doing, but there's some benefits in thinking about things as not having to check for null constantly, because if we want this to be optionally null, then we're going to use the null operator here to say this is now nullable, and it doesn't have to be a non-null value. This can complicate converting projects, and so a lot of people are turning that off, but I wanted you to be aware of it so that it didn't bite you. The other is implicit usings, and that is that Microsoft has a list of using statements that when that's turned on, don't ever have to be added in here. So you're going to see things like link and system and console and all of those things. They're implicitly, a lot of the core .NET framework pieces are going to be included in your project by default. And the last thing I'll show you is something called, where'd my mouse go? There we go. It's something called global using. So we've all seen something like this, say, environment, right? We have a using statement. We don't have to be using it, but let's say IO. There we go. If we only want to use this directive once, we can also do something called global usings that you'll see in a lot of these projects. And this essentially says that as long as this is said somewhere in my project, this will be available everywhere. And so if here in the program or in its own file, you have all your own usings, you don't have to have those using statements in each and every project. So some of these changes are going to be harder for new developers to go, wait, this isn't the language I'm used to. What are they trying to make this into Python or whatever? And the reality is no. Most of your code is still going to look like just the same sort of code that you're used to here, right? There's nothing magical about what's happening, but they're allowing you to opt into some features that should add some quality improvements. And for a lot of the projects you're working with, even existing projects, if you decide to use C# 10, you're going to gain some of these benefits. So while this isn't specific to Visual Studio 2022, you're going to see some benefit in using it with Visual Studio 2022 and the latest version of C#. So let's talk about another issue. So I'm going to, this is using Razor Pages, and so this is just sort of an example of this. But by default, you can turn on hot reload for a project. And for some reason, it's not turning it on. What is that? That would be embarrassing. Okay, there we go. I'm going to say enable AI-assisted code because we're going to need this. This happens a lot in Visual Studio 22 where it's asking you about this, whether you want to use the AI-assisted code on every new project. So you'll see that sometimes. But when we're running, you'll see this magic icon called hot reload. And so if we have a project like this where we just have some application and we're running it, many of the changes that you'll be able to make in a project, it will automatically reload into the browser or into your WPF or your WinForms or your web form apps. All of those are going to support this idea of hot reload. So if we go ahead and open up that page, and let's just say, welcome to Visual Studio. And typically this is turned on to hot reload on file save. So you can turn that off and manually restart the application. But once I press save here and I come back, we'll see that it's reloading it directly in the browser with its existing state. It's not refreshing the page. It's actually injecting it into that page. And that would be the same for almost any other project. Hot reload ends up being a great way to sort of have that iterative development that we've all wanted for a long time. And there have been features like it in Visual Studio that worked at different levels of success, and this continues to be the case. If I come in here and I make a change, there are a class of changes here that it can't reload. And one of them is changing a constructor so I've changed the constructor, and you'll see this edit continue, which should say hot reload because it's sort of the rebranding of edit continue, cannot be compiled because there's a list of changes that are going to cause you to go, I'm going to need to stop debugging and restart. So the reload isn't, the hot reload isn't magical. There are still some limitations, but you're going to be able to do a lot of the sort of ideas here. Now, if you're using the console at all, you can also see that hot reload is enabled when you do .NET Watch. So if we look at running this with .NET Watch, by default, hot reload is enabled. And so this will give you that same experience where as you change the files, even though we're not running in Visual Studio. And so different people work in different ways. After Microsoft removed it from .NET Watch and then had to put it back in because it was a silly decision, you'll see that there's some real benefits into doing that. The next feature I wanted to talk about is just performance improvements. And so this is going to be across different versions, across different kind of project types. So if I open, let me close this and reopen another solution. Where did it go? Oops. Open a new solution. Let's close that solution. And I'm going to open up a project. Well, that's not going to show you the big change. Where is my other project? Well, this is embarrassing. I was going to try to show you a huge WinForms project. Let me look at one last place that I probably forgot it. Well, that's very embarrassing. It's been an embarrassing day for Sean. So one of the things I was trying to show you, and for some reason I can't find the project that I had downloaded from Microsoft, but being able to load these incredibly large projects I'm using inside of your solution is a whole lot faster. Now, it's still doing a lot of background compilation and things, but it should open up multi-project solutions incredibly faster than it used to. Some of this is about 64-bit, just literally having more space, and another part of it is going to be about the change to Visual Studio and how it's loading these projects and how it's doing it in some ways in a deferred way. So one of the examples I had that unfortunately I can't show you was I opened up the actual project that does WebForms, the WebForms open source project, and it was able to open it up in less than 10 seconds, which if you've ever dealt with a large enterprise app, which I'm sure a lot of you have, you know that that's almost miraculous. And so you should see, if you're using the sort of one giant project, you should see a lot of performance improvements there. So let's talk about refactoring a bit. One of the things that is interesting about the way that Microsoft is trying to help is with this idea of AI. And so if we go back to let's go anywhere in this project. actually go back to the other project, sorry. So if I come into any C# file and I start to try to add some properties, so I go public string, and you'll notice almost immediately it's trying to guess what I'm trying to do in context of where I am in this application, right? It knows that it has seen other projects that are deriving from page model, and it doesn't see an onGet, which is a common thing to do inside Razor pages, and so it's trying to guess. And if I press tab, it's going to give me one section, and I was like, it's probably going to be a string. And if I just start typing var string, you'll see that what it's trying to do is help you in context. So if we could do the same thing in program.cs, and let's come up here and say app. App used to just give us this list of IntelliSense of things that were inside of there, but it's also here going, oh, you know what? I wonder if this is what you want instead. And if you press tab, it's going to help you figure out what all those are. Now, this is Visual Studio incorporating the same thing that Visual Studio Code added a while back to some controversy, and that is a GitHub pilot. So effectively has used GitHub as a data set for the kinds of things we might want to do. Now, is it always right? No. But one of the things that I found interesting is sometimes the code comments can really help it guess what you want as well. Of course, it's not doing a very good job now. But you're going to see in your code that this AI driven, it's really machine learning driven. We always keep on using AI in ways that don't appreciate. It's going to help you try to solve these common tasks that you're used to. And depending on the data set, whether that's JavaScript, TypeScript, C#, Python, whatever it is, you're going to see it try to guess some of those. And because it's reliant on the same garbage in, garbage out problem, you're going to see at times bad results. That doesn't mean Microsoft is trying to push you to do one thing or another. It's that it is dealing with the data set of code that's publicly available out there, and that is only as good as the people who wrote it. Does that make sense? Oh, good. We're right on time, I think. So let's go ahead and open up an existing project I have with Razor. I said Razor. Yeah. So Razor is this language that is used both in Blazor and in a number of different other projects like ASP.NET MVC, Razor Pages, etc. And the new Razor editor is something that really could help you in that it's really trying to allow you to more quickly develop these things. And this was always my complaint about Razor editor, was that things I was used to in C# just weren't available. So if I decide to come down here and I say here, and I want to say at date time, probably is a good one to include program. I'm trying to think of a good example. That's embarrassing. But this will allow you to do more refactoring than you're ever sort of used to. So if I say identity dot, one of the things you'll see is it's going to allow you to automatically add usings, which it never used to. And so these usings can help you build out the pages for unidentified. Now, when you're having your own client code, this is probably much more useful than something like identity. But you're also going to see in IntelliCode here for Razor-specific things. Like here, we have a code block, and it wants to extract it into code behind. Now, this page doesn't have a code behind yet, right? It's just an index.razor, and this will move it and then actually create that page. And so the Razor editor is trying to help you with these common case problems as much as possible. Now notice the Razor didn't change. All it did was move this code into code behind, which is probably what we should have been doing from the beginning. And so the Razor Designer ends up being an important change, especially if you're doing MVC, Razor Pages, or Blazor. And these changes are reflected in all the places where the Razor editor is happening. So let's talk about something a little older and longer in the tooth, and that is, let's start with WPF. So live preview was something that we used to have in Visual Studio quite a long time ago for WPF, and we had sort of a specialized one-way preview for, or even designer in web forms, and those haven't gotten a lot of love. In fact, some of the changes to the way that Visual Studio was built in 2017 and 2019 made those editors not stop work, or they lost some functionality as other architectural changes were made. And so what has happened now is they've put the investment in to make this work in exactly the way you want. Now, one of the problems with new XAML projects is this waiting for IntelliSense takes way longer than you want. So I'm not going to make you wait on that. Let's go look at the web forms at the same time while it thinks in the background. Luckily, I have a pretty hefty machine, so we shouldn't be CPU bound. Here we have a simple web forms project, and we now have down here, we can go to a design view or a split view, so we can have that sort of live. So if I come here and I start typing, you'll see that it's changing it directly here in the web form. And in the same vein, I'll change this to this is your contact page, and it can change it in that direction as well. In the case of making changes in the code, you'll see the design view is out of sync. Click here to synchronize, though pressing Control S to save will also synchronize it. So this is much more a way to look at and to design your application by typing directly in this editor. And this is a brand new recreation of the way that web forms development used to be, and should be a lot better than what you're used to. And notice that it's handling all of the sort of parts of the application. And you'll notice that I can change all of this main content. We can see main content, but it's also hosting the layout form as well. Of course, it's not letting me change the layout because that's not in this file. If I said double click, I didn't mean that. If I go over to the layout or the site master, you can tell I've been using MVC too long, I can go ahead and make changes in that layout as well. So if I change this to, our app, switch over to contact, it's already changed over here. So, for a technology that powers 80% of .NET development, it's important to me that Visual Studio 22 has brought back the investment in these tools that are so crucial to so many enterprises out there. And now the XAML project is caught up, and you'll see that it has this same old blend-like editor that we've had for WPF before, and that we're getting live preview again. Used to be that changing one didn't help with the other, so if I come down here and say 320, it changes there, and if I come over here and change the width here, it also will not affect the change here in my case, the stack panel. Or let's make this wider. We'll see it actually affect it here in the text width. And you can see it's happening as fast as humanly possible. It doesn't suffer from the synchronization problem that the web forms does, but you can see both of them are really giving us a good experience for live viewing. So the last feature before I start to take questions I wanted to talk about was multi-repo projects. So let me close a couple of these. And let's open the multi-repo. And I don't even get to do my joke anymore about move your mouse clockwise while it loads, because it loads these so quickly. But here I have a project, a solution with two projects in it that exist in two different repos. I have a ShawLink project, which is a little project that I maintain, and then 2 Weeks Ready, which is a Richard Campbell driven charity project that I work on. And when I look at Git, normally it would just show me the first Git it encountered, but now it says, oh, you know, which repositories. And in fact, if I make changes to more than one project at once, I can actually commit to all repositories at once. It'll take the same message and do check-ins to both repositories if there's changes in both projects. So if I come over here, and I'm not really going to check this in, but if I looked at base function and then in my other project, I said build a second time, which of course isn't going to work, but you can see where we're at. I'm stuck with the errors. And in Git, when I make these changes, it'll commit to both repositories, or I can pick to just look at one repository or the other, right? You can make those choices now. But this is an experimental feature right now, or they don't want it getting and confusing people. And so this is actually hidden in Manage Preview Features. So if we click Manage Preview Features, we'll see several features that are turned off or turned on by default. And you see that most of these are actually turned on by default. But this one, normally, the multi-repo support is not checked by default. I've checked it, so I can show it to you in this demo. But this is how you'd opt into something. So one of the things that we talked about earlier with large projects being loaded, this allows you to get at the code and start working faster, but some things like IntelliSense are going to be loaded and brought forward in the background. If you wanted to turn that off, then you would get that older experience where it waits until everything's ready before giving you the project. Some people love, some people hate that, so you can always turn that off. And yeah, you can see the other ones. I'm not going to belabor those. And so, you know, I've talked about mostly new features in Visual Studio that are supported across a number of different projects. Let me go back to the slides. And so I think for a lot of enterprises, unless there's a huge reason to avoid it, we really could benefit from moving to Visual Studio 2022. There any questions?
Yes, there are, Sean. And congratulations on a great presentation. The first question, I'd like to remind the audience so we can take questions until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour. So please send them on in. The first question comes from Jeff. He says, you mentioned you've invested effort into .NET MAUI. What are the best resources to study and practice MAUI?
I've spent a bit of time. There's a couple of early previews that I've played with, and if you want to be ready for MAUI, as the last presenter talked about, probably the best way to be ready for MAUI is to look at Xamarin Forms. Xamarin Forms is what MAUI is becoming. There's sort of a difference in my mind between Xamarin and Xamarin Forms. Xamarin is a way that you can write native apps with shared code, whereas Xamarin Forms and what will become MAUI is more of a if you want to forgive the probably bad press that I'll get in trouble for on Twitter later for, but it's essentially WinForms for multiple devices. It's a set of controls for building enterprise-y apps that's been out for a while, and that's maturing into Maui, I believe. That's the way I view it. And so being ready for that. If you're already familiar with XAML, you kind of have the 80% step up. They're trying to coalesce a single set of XAML with Maui. So essentially, we have the WPF, and we used to have the Silverlight version of it, and then Xamarin had their sort of own flavor, and they're trying to coalesce them into one spec that both Maui and Uno, frankly, will use. Like, it's going to be the same sort of design language for all of these. So honestly, instead of worrying about the previews, go take a look at Xamarin Forms.
Okay, great.
More questions?
Yes, there are. Next one comes from Tom. He asks, you still have to restart Visual Studio if one project has ClearCase repo and another Git repo?
I don't know. I haven't worked with ClearCase in a long time, so I haven't tested that, to be perfectly honest with you. One thing that is either a benefit or a detriment, it's kind of up to you. Microsoft has added restart to the file menu, so to making restarting Visual Studio easier. I'm not sure if that's a good or a bad thing, but restarting is easier if that is still required, but I don't know. I'm sorry.
Fair enough. Next question comes from Jason. He says, we need to use Visual Studio for our robotics club for coding. What can we do to make the install better?
Better is such a subjective thing. Visual Studio Installer, I think, does a pretty good job. But my understanding is there are ways to have sort of pre-built packages of the components you need instead of having that. Installer can be quite daunting, and you can script what you need for that installer. I would look at the Visual Studio documentation, because there is a section on pre-building it, because a lot of organizations will do this where they're like, this is the package of Visual Studio that you need, and so by running the script instead of using the installer interactively, you'll be able to install the flavor of what you need, and I think that would probably work for what you're looking at, because it can be daunting to know which of those magic packages and which of those individual features you need.
Okay, great. Okay, Sean, now you need to bring out your crystal ball. The question from Stephen reads, do we know if Microsoft will be removing TFS, Azure DevOps?
I'm going to guess no. There's a lot of investment there. I think you've seen that with TFS that they're moving to a more Git-based model, but I think that TFS and GitHub have overlapping concerns, and I think you'll see some cohesion there, but I don't think that Azure DevOps is necessarily going to go away. They may transition to a third shared project or solution, but I'm not that close to that team, so it's hard for me to say that they won't. I don't want to be caught in that head, but I don't think so. I don't think TFS would go away anytime soon. There's a lot of investment that companies have in it. If they're still doing web forms, my guess is they'll still be doing TFS / Azure DevOps for quite a long time.
Okay. Looks like we have time for one more question. It's a very simple one. Will my Net Framework app work in Visual Studio 2022?
Yes.
Okay.
Simple answer. Yep.
Good enough. All right. Looks like that's all the questions we have time for. Thanks again, Sean, for an excellent presentation and answering those questions.
If they want to follow me over to Twitter at Sean Wildermuth on Twitter to ask questions I didn't get to today, feel free. I'm always have Twitter open. I'm happy to help.
Okay, great. Thank you.